The first thing I saw on my 33rd birthday was my husband smiling at someone who wasn't me. The terrace of our hillside home in Scottsdale shimmered under string lights, champagne glasses chiming like tiny bells in the desert night. Investors laughed near the infinity pool. A jazz trio played something soft and expensive. I had spent weeks planning this party, not just for myself, but for the image of us. The Coles, stable, untouchable. Nathan stood near the outdoor fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other wrapped around a crystal tumbler. He tapped it lightly with a fork. "Everyone," he said, flashing that polished boardroom smile. "I need to step away earlier than expected. An important partner is flying to Paris tonight. I promised I'd see her off." Her. Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone made a joke about dedication to international expansion. Nathan leaned in, kissed my cheek, and whispered, "Don't make this difficult." By the front door, I noticed something I hadn't before: his overnight bag. Packed. Waiting. Before the first guest had even arrived. He hadn't planned to stay. As he walked past the cake with my name written in gold icing, I realized something cold and humiliating. I wasn't losing my husband that night. I was being replaced in public. After he left, the party kept breathing without him. That was the strangest part. Music continued. Champagne poured. Conversations resumed in smaller, tighter circles. But something had shifted. Like a draft through an expensive room. Nathan's assistant, Claire, avoided looking at me as she gathered a few discarded glasses. One of the investors' wives, Marianne, touched my arm gently and said, "These international deals can be so demanding." Her eyes held sympathy she didn't dare put into words. Near the driveway, I heard Claire speaking quietly to the driver. "Make sure he gets there before boarding. She hates waiting." Not the client, not the partner. I stood there for a moment, watching the taillights disappear down the hill. The desert night swallowed them whole. I went back inside. I thanked people for coming. I cut my own cake. I smiled so convincingly that 2 different guests complimented my composure. I had helped build the European expansion strategy from scratch. I negotiated 2 of the company's largest acquisitions. And yet, somehow, I was no longer part of the story being told about our future. When the last guest finally left and the catering staff cleared the terrace, the house felt cavernous. Too quiet. I walked through the kitchen, heels clicking on marble, replaying the past year in fragments. The late-night investor calls, the sudden privacy around expense reports, the way Nathan had started traveling without sharing itineraries. In the downstairs office, the desk lamp was still on. I don't know what made me open the trash bin beside it. Instinct. Maybe inside was a crumpled printout. Boarding confirmation. Scottsdale to Paris. One way. Passenger. Isabelle Laurent. My name wasn't anywhere on that page. Neither was the word return. 2 years earlier, there had been whispers. A charity gala. A woman who lingered too long near Nathan. Rumors I chose to dismiss because protecting the family business seemed more important than protecting my pride. I told myself then that endurance was strength. Tonight felt different. This wasn't careless flirting. This was logistics. Strategy. I sat down at Nathan's desk and opened the internal financial dashboard. My credentials still worked. For now. The numbers didn't scream at me. They whispered. Recurring transfers labeled International Consulting Advance. Slightly irregular timing. Larger than usual. Just small enough to avoid drawing attention in a company our size. I clicked deeper. One expense line caught my eye, an advance connected to a European property evaluation we had postponed months ago. The amount was almost identical to what we had once estimated for a luxury penthouse lease in Paris. My stomach didn't drop. It hardened. This wasn't just betrayal. It was repositioning. A few weeks ago, Nathan had laughed when I questioned a vague expense category. "You worry too much about paperwork," he said. "I handle the future." I stared at the screen now, understanding what he meant. My phone buzzed on the desk, the sound sharp in the still house. Unknown number. I hesitated before opening it. A single message. He already told her you'd agree. You always do. I read it twice. 3 times. Agree to what? Share him? Look the other way. Lose everything quietly like before. I set the phone down carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter something invisible in the room. For the first time that night, I didn't feel like crying. I felt alert. If Nathan believed I would endure this silently, smile at the party. Cut the cake alone. Pretend the Paris flight was business as usual. Then he had forgotten something very important about me. I had helped build everything he was so confident I wouldn't fight for. Nathan came home just before dawn, smelling faintly of airport cologne and something floral that didn't belong to me. I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. The house looked untouched from the night before. The caterers had cleaned everything. The flowers still stood in tall arrangements like witnesses who refused to speak. He set his overnight bag down casually, as if returning from an ordinary business trip. "You're up early," he said, loosening his tie. "Did you have a nice rest of the evening?" "Not, I'm sorry. Not, we need to talk." "Just that." I watched him carefully. There was no guilt in his expression. Only calculation. "You mean after you left my birthday party to take your mistress to the airport?" I asked. He didn't flinch. He didn't even deny it. "Nora," he said evenly, "don't reduce this to something small." Small? I felt something inside me go still. Later that morning, he asked me to come to his office downtown. The message wasn't phrased as a request. It was phrased as a schedule adjustment. 11 o'clock. Executive floor. When I stepped into his glass-walled office overlooking Scottsdale, he was already seated behind his desk. Calm, polished, prepared. A leather folder rested in front of him. "We need to address reality," he began. "I care about you. I respect what we've built. But my life has expanded. I won't apologize for wanting more." "More," I repeated. He leaned back in his chair. "Isabel isn't a fling. She understands the global direction I'm taking the company. Paris is just the beginning." There it was. Not an affair. A direction. And where do I fit into this expansion? I asked quietly. "That depends on you." He slid the leather folder across the desk. Inside was a draft amendment to the company's governance structure. It redefined executive voting authority. It removed my access to certain strategic decisions. It reassigned oversight committees. My name, which had once appeared alongside his in advisory capacity, was absent. "You're trying to remove me," I said. "I'm trying to protect the company from emotional interference," he replied smoothly. "You've been distracted." Distracted. "I built half those European projections," I said. "You assisted," he corrected. Then he said the words that would echo in my mind for weeks. "You can accept the structure of my life and remain exactly where you are. Or you can challenge me and risk losing everything." I looked at him carefully. "Define everything." "The house," he said without hesitation. "Your board influence, access to the family trust distributions. My father's will is flexible. Nora, you know that—" He let that sink in. "If you stand beside me publicly, none of that changes. You keep your lifestyle, your position, our name. And privately," he didn't look away. "Privately, you understand that I am not limiting myself to one relationship." The room felt suddenly airless. "You want me to share you," I said. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. "You'd be surprised how many wives choose discretion," he added, "especially when the alternative is unnecessary loss." Loss. As if dignity were a line item. I closed the folder slowly. "And if I don't accept?" He folded his hands. "Then we restructure leadership. My brother already supports modernization. My father is stepping back. It would be unfortunate for you to stand in the way of progress." Modernization. That was what they were calling it. "You planned this," I said softly. He tilted his head. I prepared for resistance. A flash of clarity cut through me. Has your father seen this amendment? I asked. A slight pause. Barely noticeable. He's retired from day-to-day decisions, Nathan said. That wasn't an answer. I stood, holding the folder. You always endure, he said, almost gently. You survived the rumors 2 years ago. You'll survive this. Think practically. That was when I understood something he didn't. He believed my silence in the past had been weakness. He believed loyalty meant compliance. He believed I would weigh comfort against pride and choose comfort. As I reached the door, he added one final detail. Isabel isn't moving back to France. We're aligning long-term. I'd rather you adjust now than be blindsided later. Long-term? This wasn't temporary. It wasn't impulsive. It was strategic. In the elevator, alone, I opened the folder again. My eyes scanned the legal language, the restructuring clauses, the redistribution of voting power. Tucked near the back was a reference memo. Morality review provision, inactive. Inactive. Not removed. Waiting. For the first time since my birthday night, I felt something other than humiliation. I felt memory. 8 years earlier, during a governance overhaul, I had insisted on safeguards. Quietly. Carefully. Without announcement. Nathan thought he was offering me a choice. Share him or lose everything. What he didn't realize was that the definition of everything was about to change. The word inactive stayed with me the entire ride down. I stood alone in the mirrored elevator at headquarters, the amendment folder tucked under my arm, my reflection staring back at me from every angle. Morality review provision, inactive. That was the phrase printed in small, almost forgettable type near the back of the governance appendix. Inactive didn't mean erased. It meant waiting. By the time the elevator doors opened to the lobby, the humiliation from my birthday party had shifted into something steadier. Colder. Nathan thought he had cornered me with an ultimatum. Share him or lose everything. But he had forgotten that I had once helped write the rules of that everything. I drove straight to Phoenix to see Rebecca Langford, my personal attorney. I hadn't needed her in years. Our meetings had always been routine, estate updates, minor contractual reviews. This time, I walked into her office carrying a folder that felt heavier than it should. I told her everything. The birthday party, the Paris flight, the ultimatum, the proposed amendment stripping my voting authority. Isabelle Laurent. Rebecca listened without interrupting, then opened the shareholders' agreement and began turning pages with deliberate calm. When she reached Appendix F, she stopped. She didn't speak right away. She adjusted her glasses and read it twice. Well, she said finally, this isn't inactive in the way he thinks it is. She explained that the morality review provision was binding. It applied to executive misconduct that materially harmed the company's reputation or exposed it to financial liability. If triggered, it allowed the board to suspend voting control pending investigation. But there was a threshold. It can't be about infidelity alone, she said. It has to connect to fiduciary duty or corporate harm. That was when I told her about the transfers labeled as international consulting advances, about the penthouse estimate, about the one-way ticket. Rebecca leaned back slowly. If company funds were used to support a personal relationship without disclosure, that's not a marriage issue. That's governance. 8 years earlier, I had been sitting at a very different table. Robert Cole Sr. was still CEO then. We had gathered at the house for a private dinner after Nathan made a reckless investment that cost the company more than anyone admitted publicly. Robert had been furious, not about the money, but about the exposure. Reputation is everything, he told me that night, after the others left the room. A company can recover from losses. It doesn't recover from scandal. He confided something he had never said in front of Nathan. He worried his son lacked restraint. That charm came too easily. That discipline did not. I had chosen my words carefully. What if there were a safeguard? I suggested, not against failure, but against misconduct. He studied me for a long moment before asking what I meant. We worked with counsel to insert a conduct-based review clause tied to executive authority. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't accuse anyone. It simply required that leadership maintain ethical and fiduciary standards, with board oversight if breached. Robert approved it quietly. There are times, he told me, when protection must be written into the structure. He also made one request. Don't tell Nathan this came from you. Back in Rebecca's office, that memory no longer felt like caution. It felt like preparation. Rebecca advised me to gather evidence. Hard documentation, not assumptions. I returned home and logged into archived expense reports through the secure portal I still had access to. The numbers unfolded in patterns. Transfers routed through a Nevada-based marketing firm I didn't recognize. Recurring deposits labeled as International Strategic Development. I searched the firm's registration. The listed agent's address was tied to an office building in Reno that housed dozens of shell companies. The next detail made my pulse slow instead of spike. The secondary contact email on the filing contained Daniel Jr. '(S) initials. This wasn't impulsive. It was structured. I cross-referenced travel records. Nathan had claimed a Zurich investor meeting 3 months earlier. There was no signed memorandum from that trip. No investor summary. Nothing entered into the development pipeline. Yet the expense allocation matched a luxury hotel stay. I opened Isabel's public social media account. She wasn't careful. A photo from Zurich posted the same week. The same skyline visible from the balcony. If infidelity was the personal betrayal, misuse of funds was the corporate one. My phone buzzed. A new email notification. From Robert Sr. His private address. The subject line read, Governance Update. The message itself was short. And it had been sent weeks ago but forwarded to me only now by the estate attorney. If there is ever reason to question executive judgment, it read, Ensure the review mechanisms are honored. Structure exists for a reason. He didn't mention Nathan by name. He didn't need to. Rebecca had warned me that activating the clause would be public. Messy. It would invite scrutiny. It would fracture the family. But as I stared at the Zurich timestamp, the shell registration, the Paris penthouse transfer, I understood something clearly. Nathan believed he controlled the narrative. He thought I was reacting as a hurt wife. He didn't realize I was assembling evidence as a fiduciary officer. I zoomed into the Paris balcony photo again. The branded glassware from one of our own development properties sat on the table beside Isabel's hand. Company assets. Private indulgence. If he wanted to make this international, I was ready to make it corporate. I zoomed in on the photograph until the pixels blurred. Nathan stood on a Paris balcony. City lights glowing behind him. Isabel's hand resting possessively on his chest. At first glance, it looked like a romantic snapshot. But in the corner of the image, barely visible on a glass table between them, was a logo I knew too well. Cole Development Group. Branded glassware from one of our luxury furnished properties. He hadn't just taken her to Paris. He had taken her into company space. I lowered the phone slowly. The humiliation I had felt at my birthday party no longer burned. It crystallized. This wasn't a private betrayal. It was corporate exposure. Back home, I opened my laptop and accessed archived financial ledgers. My credentials still worked. For now, I filtered transactions under international consulting. At first, the entries looked routine, strategic advances, expansion retainers, exploratory travel budgets. But patterns reveal themselves to those who know where to look. Recurring transfers, identical intervals, round numbers just below internal audit thresholds. One vendor name repeated frequently, Laurent Strategic Advisory, Laurent. My fingers stilled on the keyboard. I searched Nevada corporate registrations. The entity existed, recently formed, registered agent, a legal services firm in Reno. Digging deeper, I found the managing member listed under a holding structure, Daniel Cole Jr., Nathan's younger brother. I leaned back in my chair, letting the implications settle. This wasn't reckless passion. It was coordinated. The money wasn't flowing randomly. It was routed. I began documenting everything. Screenshots. Transaction EDS. Dates. Internal memos authorizing discretionary executive expenditure. Each piece alone looked defensible. Together, they told a different story. The next layer came when I accessed property management software. The Paris penthouse lease appeared under a European feasibility project we had postponed 6 months earlier. The deposit was charged to corporate expansion reserves. Furnishings were coded as client staging. Client staging. I remembered pitching a housing initiative for junior employees relocating internationally. It had been denied for budget concerns. Yet somehow, there was funding for silk drapes and imported marble coffee tables in Paris. My jaw tightened. This was no longer about a mistress. This was about misuse of legacy capital. I needed confirmation from someone internal. Mark Feldman, our compliance officer, answered my call on the second ring. "Is this about the board notice?" he asked quietly. "Partly," I replied. "But I need clarity on flagged transactions." There was a pause. Then a sigh. "I raised questions weeks ago," he admitted. "I was told executive discretion applied. By Nathan. By Daniel Jr. He said European relationships required flexibility." I closed my eyes briefly. "Were any of those flags formally dismissed?" "No," Mark said. "They were deprioritized." I understood what that meant. Buried. "Mark," I said carefully, "if this escalates, will you confirm what you saw?" Silence stretched between us. "Yes," he said finally. "But if you move fast." After we hung up, I accessed travel reconciliation reports. Nathan had listed a Zurich investor summit 2 months ago. I remembered that week. He had barely texted. The hotel invoice attached to the expense claim didn't match the conference venue. It matched a boutique hotel 3 blocks away. I checked Isabel's social media. She had posted a photo that same week. Captioned simply, "New beginnings." Location tag, Zurich. The timestamps overlapped perfectly. He hadn't even been careful. The more I assembled, the clearer it became. This wasn't simply infidelity. It was deception of shareholders, misrepresentation of corporate travel, diversion of funds for personal benefit. That qualified under the morality provision. My phone buzzed late that evening. Mark again. "They tried to access archived expense logs," he said. Voice low. IT flagged unusual administrative credentials. "Whose?" I asked. "Daniel Jr. I felt something shift inside me. They weren't just hiding the truth. They were trying to erase it. That meant they knew. They knew the clause existed. Or at least suspected. I organized the documents into a secure file. Cross-referenced transaction chains. Drafted a formal outline of breach points. If I activated the clause without airtight proof, they would paint me as a jealous wife weaponizing governance. But this was no longer emotional. This was fiduciary. Near midnight, another message arrived from the anonymous number. "Flights change quickly. Power changes faster." I stared at the words. Then I opened the company calendar. Emergency executive board availability slots were visible for the following week. If I was going to move, it had to be before they consolidated trust control, before records vanished, before the narrative turned against me. Nathan believed he had cornered me with an ultimatum. Share him or lose everything. He hadn't realized something essential. When you corner someone who understands the structure of the walls, sometimes they discover the hidden door. And I had just found it. I zoomed in on the photograph until the pixels blurred. Nathan stood on a Paris balcony, city lights glowing behind him, Isabel's hand resting possessively on his chest. At first glance, it looked like a romantic snapshot, but in the corner of the image, barely visible on a glass table between them, was a logo I knew too well. Cole Development Group. Branded glassware from one of our luxury furnished properties. He hadn't just taken her to Paris. He had taken her into company space. I lowered the phone slowly. The humiliation I had felt at my birthday party no longer burned. It crystallized. This wasn't a private betrayal. It was corporate exposure. Back home, I opened my laptop and accessed archived financial ledgers. My credentials still worked. For now, I filtered transactions under international consulting. At first, the entries looked routine: strategic advances, expansion retainers, exploratory travel budgets. But patterns reveal themselves to those who know where to look. Recurring transfers, identical intervals, round numbers just below internal audit thresholds. One vendor name repeated frequently: Laurent Strategic Advisory. Laurent. My fingers stilled on the keyboard. I searched Nevada corporate registrations. The entity existed. Recently formed. Registered agent. A legal services firm in Reno. Digging deeper, I found the managing member listed under a holding structure. Daniel Cole Jr., Nathan's younger brother. I leaned back in my chair, letting the implications settle. This wasn't reckless passion. It was coordinated. The money wasn't flowing randomly. It was routed. I began documenting everything. Screenshots. Transaction EDs. Dates. Internal memos authorizing discretionary executive expenditure. Each piece alone looked defensible. Together, they told a different story. The next layer came when I accessed property management software. The Paris penthouse lease appeared under a European feasibility project we had postponed 6 months earlier. The deposit was charged to corporate expansion reserves. Furnishings were coded as client staging. Client staging. I remembered pitching a housing initiative for junior employees relocating internationally. It had been denied for budget concerns. Yet somehow, there was funding for silk drapes and imported marble coffee tables in Paris. My jaw tightened. This was no longer about a mistress. This was about misuse of legacy capital. I needed confirmation from someone internal. Mark Feldman, our compliance officer, answered my call on the second ring. "Is this about the board notice?" he asked quietly. "Partly," I replied. "But I need clarity on flagged transactions." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I raised questions weeks ago," he admitted. "I was told executive discretion applied." By Nathan. By Daniel Jr. He said European relationships required flexibility. I closed my eyes briefly. Were any of those flags formally dismissed? "No," Mark said. "They were deprioritized." I understood what that meant. Buried. "Mark," I said carefully, "if this escalates, will you confirm what you saw?" Silence stretched between us. "Yes," he said finally. "But if you move fast." After we hung up, I accessed travel reconciliation reports. Nathan had listed a Zurich investor summit 2 months ago. I remembered that week. He had barely texted. The hotel invoice attached to the expense claim didn't match the conference venue. It matched a boutique hotel 3 blocks away. I checked Isabel's social media. She had posted a photo that same week. Captioned simply, "New beginnings." Location tag, Zurich. The timestamps overlapped perfectly. He hadn't even been careful. The more I assembled, the clearer it became. This wasn't simply infidelity. It was deception of shareholders, misrepresentation of corporate travel, diversion of funds for personal benefit. That qualified under the morality provision. My phone buzzed late that evening. Mark again. "They tried to access archived expense logs," he said. Voice low. IT flagged unusual administrative credentials. "Who's?" I asked. "Daniel Jr." I felt something shift inside me. They weren't just hiding the truth. They were trying to erase it. That meant they knew. They knew the clause existed, or at least suspected. I organized the documents into a secure file, cross-referenced transaction chains, drafted a formal outline of breach points. If I activated the clause without airtight proof, they would paint me as a jealous wife weaponizing governance. But this was no longer emotional. This was fiduciary. Near midnight, another message arrived from the anonymous number. "Flights change quickly. Power changes faster." I stared at the words. Then I opened the company calendar. Emergency executive board availability slots were visible for the following week. If I was going to move, it had to be before they consolidated trust control, before records vanished, before the narrative turned against me. Nathan believed he had cornered me with an ultimatum. Share him or lose everything. He hadn't realized something essential. When you corner someone who understands the structure of the walls, sometimes they discover the hidden door. And I had just found it. By the next morning, the story had already begun to leak. It wasn't front-page news. Not yet. But a financial blogger posted a short piece about leadership instability at Coal Development Group. The wording was cautious, almost polite, but the implication was clear. Investors read between lines. I stood in the executive office that had once belonged to Nathan and watched the desert sun rise over downtown Scottsdale. His name was still on the door. His authority was not. My phone buzzed nonstop, board members requesting updates, department heads seeking reassurance, legal confirming procedural steps. The morality review provision had done what it was designed to do. It froze him. By evening, Nathan came home. He didn't slam the door. He closed it too carefully. "You embarrassed me," he said, standing in the foyer like a man who had misplaced his crown. In front of the board. In front of my father. "You embarrassed yourself," I replied evenly. "This was a domestic issue," he snapped. "You escalated it into a corporate crisis. You funded your domestic issue with corporate money." His jaw tightened. "The review will clear me," he insisted. "Those expenditures were strategic. Then you should have disclosed them." He paced across the marble floor. "You crossed a line." I almost smiled at that. "You gave me an ultimatum." I said, "Share you or lose everything." I chose governance. He stopped pacing. "Do you understand what you've triggered?" he demanded. "Trust distributions are paused. Accounts are under scrutiny. You didn't just freeze my voting power, you froze liquidity." There it was. The real panic. Later that night, there was a knock at the door. Evelyn Cole stood outside, impeccably dressed, pearls at her throat, her posture rigid but uncertain. She rarely visited without notice. "Nora," she said softly, stepping inside. "May we speak privately?" Nathan retreated upstairs without protest. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had waited for him the morning after my birthday. "I suspected something," Evelyn admitted, hands folded tightly. "About Isabel. I hoped it would fade." "It didn't," I said. She nodded slowly. "Your father-in-law postponed signing the succession transition papers last month. He told me he felt uneasy. He didn't say why. Succession transition. So it had already been in motion. Nathan wanted control consolidated before the next fiscal quarter," she added quietly. "He said modernization required decisiveness." Modernization. That word again. "Did he mention removing me?" I asked. Her silence was answer enough. "I didn't know the details," she said finally, "but I knew you were being sidelined. For the first time since this began, someone from his family acknowledged it. You protected the company," she said, almost reluctantly. "Whether Nathan sees that or not." Her words didn't feel like praise. They felt like recognition. After she left, Rebecca called with an update. "The suspension triggered automatic limitations," she explained. "Nathan's discretionary access to trust funds is restricted pending outcome." "Restricted how?" "Certain transfers require secondary authorization now." As if on cue, another alert pinged on my phone. A flagged transfer attempt. Significant. Routed toward an international account. The timestamp matched the morning Isabel's return flight had been scheduled. "Her flight's been canceled," Rebecca added. Of course it had. When access to capital tightens, loyalty evaporates. Nathan found me later in the master bedroom. He looked smaller somehow. "They froze accounts," he said. Not accusatory this time, just stunned. "You've made me look reckless." "You did that yourself." He ran a hand through his hair. "Daniel pushed for the restructuring. He said we needed to secure control before outside investors gained leverage." "So you thought removing me would simplify things?" I asked. "You were unpredictable." "Unpredictable. You mean I asked questions?" He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. If you withdraw the complaint, he said quietly, this can be contained. Isabel will leave permanently. We issue a unified statement. We move on. It was almost tempting in its simplicity. Undo the detonation. Restore appearances. Resume silence. But I saw it clearly now. He wasn't asking for reconciliation. He was asking for damage control. I won't withdraw it, I said. He looked up sharply. You're destroying your own security. Security built on humiliation was never security. The next morning, my phone rang before 7. Robert Cole Sr. I need to see you, he said without preamble. Alone. His voice carried weight. Not anger. Not confusion. Gravitas. I want to understand exactly what my son has risked. He continued. I stared out the window at the desert horizon, the sun just breaking over the mountains. This had stopped being about my marriage. It had become about inheritance, about legacy, about who would carry the Cole name forward. And for the first time, Nathan was not the only one being evaluated. Robert's office felt colder than usual. He sat behind a wide mahogany desk, legal folders stacked neatly in front of him, his longtime estate attorney seated to his left. The room carried the weight of decades, photographs of groundbreaking ceremonies, framed newspaper clippings. The first blueprint of Cole Development Group. Nora, he said quietly, gesturing for me to sit. I want clarity, not emotion, not accusation, facts. That's all I've brought, I replied. I laid out the documentation in careful sequence. The shell company registration tied to Daniel Jr., the expense transfers, the Paris penthouse lease funded under expansion reserves, the Zurich discrepancy, the attempted deletion of archived records. I didn't mention the birthday party. I didn't mention humiliation. This wasn't about marriage. Robert listened without interruption. His jaw tightened only once when I described the trust restructuring timeline. He initiated succession acceleration before the quarter closed. He asked. Yes. And he presented you with an ultimatum during this period. Yes. Robert leaned back slowly. I built this company to outlast personalities, he said. Not to serve them. The attorney cleared his throat gently. The morality review provision was designed for precisely this type of structural risk. Robert looked at me. I underestimated you, he admitted. I thought you were too forgiving for this family. I was patient, I said calmly. There's a difference. Silence settled between us. After a few moments, Robert turned to his attorney. Prepare documentation suspending succession transition until review concludes. Amend advisory privileges for both my sons pending audit. Both. The word hung in the air. Daniel as well. The attorney confirmed. Yes, Robert said firmly. If he facilitated this structure, he shares responsibility. For the first time since this began, I felt something shift at the highest level. Control was no longer consolidating around Nathan. It was recalibrating entirely. Later that evening, Nathan confronted me in the study. He didn't bother with pleasantries. What did you say to him? He demanded. The truth. You poisoned him against me. I showed him documents. He paced in front of the bookshelf. Agitation barely contained. He suspended the succession review, Nathan said. He's questioning Daniel's involvement. Do you understand what that does to us? It protects the company, I replied. He stopped pacing. You chose corporate warfare over your own marriage. You chose to hand me an ultimatum, I said evenly. Share you or lose everything. That wasn't a threat, he insisted. It was reality. It was control. His composure cracked. You humiliated me in that boardroom, he said. Voice lower now. You turned me into a suspect. You made yourself one. He exhaled sharply. She left, he said suddenly. Isabel? Yes. She flew out this morning. Without access to trust funds, without corporate-backed penthouse security. Did she say goodbye? I asked. He didn't answer. In that silence, something became painfully clear. She had never been choosing him. She had been choosing access. Nathan ran a hand over his face. If you withdraw the complaint, he said. Softer now. I'll end it. Completely. We issue a unified statement. We rebuild. Rebuild what? I asked. An image. He looked at me as if I were being unreasonable. You'd keep everything? He pressed. The house. Your title. Your lifestyle. There it was again. Everything. I held his gaze. I don't want everything, I said. I want dignity. You're being dramatic. No, I replied. I'm being clear. He stared at me for a long moment, then said something that revealed more than he intended. I never thought you'd actually fight. That was the truth. He had misread endurance as weakness. I walked to my desk and opened a folder he hadn't noticed. I've scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney, I said calmly. Not because of the money. Because of the pattern. He looked stunned. You'd dismantle your own security over this. Security built on humiliation isn't security, I said. For once, he had no immediate rebuttal. That night, he packed a suitcase quietly. No shouting, no shattered glass. Just the quiet rustle of fabric and zippers. At the door, he paused. You'll regret this, he said. You're dismantling the future we built. I'm protecting the part of it that mattered, I replied. When the door closed behind him, the house felt different. Not emptier. Lighter. For the first time since my birthday, I didn't feel cornered. I felt unburdened. The ultimatum had forced a choice. He believed it was between him and everything. He never considered that I might choose myself. 6 months later, I unlocked the executive office with a key that no longer felt borrowed. The plaque outside the door read, Interim Chief Executive Officer, Eleanor Cole. It wasn't engraved in gold. It wasn't ceremonial. It was simple and clean, like the decision that had put it there. The skyline of Scottsdale stretched beyond the glass walls. The desert morning painted in soft amber. For the first time in years, I felt no need to look over my shoulder before stepping into that room. The internal investigation had concluded 3 weeks earlier. The findings were precise and clinical. Misuse of corporate funds. Failure to disclose material financial commitments. Breach of fiduciary duty. Governance violations. Nathan retained minority ownership under the prenuptial structure, but his executive authority was permanently removed. Voting privileges were redistributed. Oversight committees expanded. Daniel Jr. resigned quietly before formal reprimand could be issued. His statement cited personal reevaluation. No one challenged the wording. Investors responded better than expected. Stability reassured them more than denial ever could. Transparency, it turned out, was stronger than image management. Robert finalized amendments to the succession framework. Leadership would now require layered approval. No single heir would inherit unilateral control again. The morality review provision was not only retained, it was strengthened. Structure existed for a reason. The divorce moved forward with less drama than people anticipated. There were no courtroom theatrics. The prenuptial agreement held. Assets were divided as agreed years earlier, long before I understood how necessary those documents would become. Nathan requested one final private meeting before papers were signed. We met in a neutral conference room at a law office downtown. No marble floors. No skyline. Just 2 chairs and a long table. You surprised me, he said, folding his hands in front of him. I think I surprised myself, I replied. He looked tired. Not ruined. Not broken. Just recalibrated. I underestimated you, he admitted. I thought you valued comfort too much to risk it. I valued stability, I said, but not at the cost of disappearing. He nodded slowly. She wasn't what I thought, he added quietly. I didn't respond. It wasn't my responsibility to process his regrets. I didn't think you'd actually walk away, he said. You asked me to choose between sharing you and losing everything? I reminded him. I chose neither. There was no shouting, no dramatic closure, just acknowledgement. When we stood to leave, he paused. You could have destroyed me, he said. I didn't want to destroy you. I answered, I wanted accountability. That difference mattered. Back at headquarters, the transition into formal leadership unfolded steadily. I didn't claim victory speeches. I focused on systems, audit clarity, ethical reporting structures. I also launched something new, a small internal foundation focused on financial literacy and governance education for women navigating business partnerships and marriage. Workshops, quiet resources, conversations many had never been invited to have. The first session filled within days. Stories surfaced that sounded painfully familiar. Women who had been asked to understand, to be patient, to protect the image. I didn't preach. I listened. I moved out of the hillside house 2 months later. Not out of resentment, out of choice. My new home was smaller, closer to downtown. No infinity pool, no grand staircase. Just clean lines, natural light, and silence that felt peaceful rather than heavy. On my next birthday, I hosted dinner with a handful of close friends. No investors, no speeches, no performance. When the cake arrived, no one left early. I sometimes think back to that night on the terrace, the string lights, the champagne, the kiss on my cheek that felt like dismissal. At the time, it felt like loss. Now, it feels like clarity. Nathan believed the ultimatum forced me into a corner. Share him or lose everything. But the premise itself was flawed. Everything was never the house, or the title, or the trust distributions. Everything was my self-respect. Revenge was not ruining him. It was refusing to shrink so he could feel powerful. It was standing in a boardroom and saying no. It was understanding that loyalty without dignity is not loyalty at all. I don't tell this story because I enjoy the collapse of a marriage. I tell it because too many women have been handed ultimatums disguised as reality. If someone told you to accept humiliation in exchange for security, what would you choose? Would you protect the image? Or would you protect yourself? I would genuinely love to hear what you think. Share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this aren't just about one marriage or one company. They're about boundaries, legacy, and the courage to step out of silence. If this story resonated with you, if you believe dignity should never be negotiable, stay here with us. There are more conversations ahead about justice, strength, and what happens when the tables finally turn. Sometimes hearing one story at the right moment reminds you that you are not alone. And sometimes, that reminder changes everything.